April 9, 2003. As his statue fell in Paradise Square, Saddam Hussein appeared in public as the president of Iraq for the last time. American tanks already occupied half the capital. Saddam walked the streets of Baghdad's Adamiyya neighborhood and disappeared. Farouk al-Ubaidi, a former officer in Saddam's army, remembers the exact spot where Iraq's president was last seen.
صدام تواجد في هذه المنطقة أمام جسر الإمام الأعظم وعبر باتجاه الكاظمية. آخر مدينة سقطت بالعراق هي الأعظمية، ومو سقطت احتلت، وهاي المدينة كانت عصي على الأمريكان.
The U.S. military entered Baghdad with radical plans to erase the entire old regime and remake the country from the ground up. In the first months of the occupation, U.S. presidential envoy Paul Bremer disbanded the entire 800,000-man security force, purged the public sector of everyone associated with the Baathists, the ruling party under Saddam, and installed a new government led by a group of Iraqi exiles organized in America and England. The plan failed, and Iraq spiraled out of control.
It was daffy what we tried to do back in 2004.
Bing West is a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense and a leading expert on counterinsurgency. He has written 3 books on the war and has embedded with more than 60 Marine and Army units in Iraq.
I don't think Ambassador Bremer had a plan for the country. He had a hope. But the minute he did away with the Army, it was finished because there were no Iraqi leaders. So you had the American troops out there, and they were acting kind of like robo-cops because they didn't know who the enemy was. They were crashing around. It was a disaster. So the Sunnis thought, we are screwed.
For 4 years, Adamiyya was the stronghold of the Sunni resistance in the capital. From this base in one of Saddam's old palaces, American troops struggled and failed to gain control of the neighborhood, eventually sealing it off from the rest of Baghdad with these concrete walls that have become a symbol of the American occupation.
There was a feeling that we couldn't win that war. Some of our troops believed we had lost the war. And I had Marines say to me on patrol, hey, sir, don't you think they're really the nationalists and we're the invaders? And that was the prevailing sentiment toward the end of 2005, beginning of 2006.
And then, almost overnight, the war changed completely. The Americans began arming and funding Sunni militias in Anbar province, the stronghold of the insurgency to the west of Baghdad. Attacks on Americans dropped, and the program was extended throughout the country. Close to 100,000 Sunni militia members were put on the U.S. payroll, and the program is hailed as a huge success. It has led observers like Bing West to say that the U.S. is on the verge of victory in a war that 2 years ago seemed unwinnable. West says that this radical change in American strategy predated the surge and was far more important than the additional 30,000 troops requested by General David Petraeus.
The critical variable that made all the difference in Iraq was that the Sunnis changed their minds. When Petraeus came in, the war had already been won in Anbar.
The militias go by different names in different places. The Awakening, the Concerned Local Citizens, the Sons of Iraq, or SOIs. But who are these new allies of U.S. and coalition forces? And will this alliance bring long-term stability to Iraq? Here in Adamiyya, a 2,000-member militia, the Sons of Iraq, was put on the payroll and charged with running checkpoints and guaranteeing security. Attacks on Americans have dropped to their lowest levels ever. U.S. Army Lieutenant Green leads a civil affairs platoon in Adamiyya.
Some of these guys are former insurgents.
I would say no, not that we know of. So, I mean, the coalition forces wouldn't hire them if they knew any connections to former insurgency. But in an insurgency group, you don't know who 110% always is involved in an insurgency group. You could be part of an insurgency group and not even know that you're part of an insurgency group.
Although he claimed not to know it, every militia member we talked to while driving with Lieutenant Green was either a former insurgent, a former Ba'athist army officer, or both. His unit seemed to have little idea where the men they pay to guard their checkpoints come from. In April, an analyst with the RAND Corporation, a think tank established by the U.S. Army, published the most in-depth look at the awakening movement to date. It argues that in the last few years of insurgency, the tribal sheikhs who had run Anbar under Saddam and had initially supported the resistance began to see their power erode. Al-Qaeda, which began by working with powerful sheikhs, ended up trying to replace tribal authority with their own political system. Sheikhs joined the awakening when Al-Qaeda in Iraq became a greater threat to their power than the Americans. To learn more about what America's alliance with Sunni militias means for Iraq's future, we left Baghdad and traveled to Anbar, where the awakening movement began. Fallujah was the site of the most intense fighting of the occupation, and its name was once synonymous with armed resistance. But today, Sheikh Affan, who leads one of the awakening militias, drives us in across Blackwater Bridge. The charred remains of two American security contractors from the Blackwater Company were hung from these steel supports in March of 2004.
All the history of Iraq, Fallujah is the main city for all of Sunni. We call Fallujah the mother of the mosques. How you call Thawriyin? Revolutionaries. Yes. You know, the people, يعني الناس ثوريين, the people's revolution. From the beginning, the first city starts fighting very strongly against the coalition forces, Fallujah. Fallujah very famous.
When filming here in 2004, we were run out of town by masked insurgents in police uniforms, but today we can move freely through the streets. Sheikh Affan's militia helped produce this dramatic turnaround. He regularly meets with the Marines who pay the salaries of his men.
It's different here. It's different.
To make sure it's good.
Yeah, in the United States, you see two men walking like this. Sometimes it means that they like men like they like women. It's good.
You know,
Allying with the Americans has made sheikhs like Affan powerful men. Not only do they run small armies bankrolled by the U.S., but they are also put in charge of big reconstruction contracts worth tens of millions of dollars.
You should have a picture of me up next to Brother Bush.
The U.S. Military Academy's own study claims that Americans' first tribal allies in Anbar were sheikhs who used to control smuggling and organized crime. When Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, moved to secure its supply routes by monopolizing control over smuggling, these sheikhs fought to defend their commercial interests. They turned to the only military ally available to them, the Americans. This report even suggests that Abdul Sattar Abu Risha, the founder and symbol of the entire Sahwa movement before his assassination last year, was a smuggler, fighting to protect his business.
It's pretty widely acknowledged that Abu Risha family had a long-standing in smuggling.
Austin Long is a defense analyst who has written the most in-depth study of the Awakening program to date.
They were sort of lower-tier smugglers who were successful but not dominant. And I think he saw an opportunity by aligning with the United States to increase his power, his wasta, and increase his control and ability to generate revenue.
Long says sheikhs like Abu Risha initially saw greater benefits in partnering with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI.
But as you get to 2005, AQI becomes less of a partner and more wanting to actually dominate the rackets. There was a real issue about power and money. You just have a sense among a lot of tribesmen that AQI was a greater enemy than the U.S. The U.S. wasn't necessarily a friend, but it was just the lesser of two evils.
Whether Anbar sheikhs were threatened under the insurgency or benefited from it, the new alliance with the U.S. has proven to be much more profitable. American patronage is empowering a small tribal elite that guarantees security in return. To Sheikh Affan, it is a familiar strategy, one tried by Saddam Hussein.
Saddam, before he support some tribes and some sheikhs. Some of those sheikhs, he used their powerful in their area. The first support come by money. He support him by big projects, by money, and he make him very rich so that they can deal with anyone in Iraq with money. The American, they make the same plan with all the sheikhs.
Sheikh Affan chooses his words carefully, but readily admits that the U.S. is putting back into power the same elite, and in some cases exactly the same tribal leaders, that it ran out of power 5 years ago.
I know some names, but we don't like to be. But I know there is 3 main sheikhs. They was with Saddam completely. Now they are big part of the process now.
Re-empowering a Sunni elite is the key to the Awakening program, and the men at the head of this new army of Sunni militiamen are the same men who ran Iraq under Saddam's regime, tribal sheikhs and former Ba'athist army officers.
You need leaders. So the first leaders you were getting were the sheikhs. The second set of leaders that you got were those that had been in the army and had been thrown out, and they naturally self-selected themselves.
On the outskirts of Fallujah, we met a former Al-Qaeda member who now works with the Awakening. He says he joined Al-Qaeda because it promised to help kick the U.S. out of Iraq.
أول ما طبوا الأمريكان العراق التقموا يا شيوخ قالوا إحنا ناس مسالمين وهذا بلد لا تهدمونه وإحنا ما عندنا أي عارض وما عندنا أي شيء. يوم هنا بقوا وما انسحبوا لأن إحنا بلد محتل. الأمريكان ما انسحبوا وبدأ الجهاد. بدأ الجهاد يعني على الأمريكان. بدأ على الحكي هذا قاموا يجون عرب. ما شئنا نعرف كل شيء عبالهم مجاهدين لله. طناهم المجال قامت لهم الناس الضيافة. ضيفوهم أكل مبيت ما أدري شنو تعرف أنت سعوديين كويتيين أردنيين لبنانيين من كل الفئات قامت تجي وياه.
He says he broke with Al-Qaeda when it tried to rule Anbar as its own Islamic state, but he has not abandoned the insurgency.
ما عندي أي إشكال به. ماكو تناقض. اكو خط اول وخط ثاني، انا ابدا بالاول هسه، الاول القاعده والثاني امريكي. بعدين الامريكي اذا انسحب، اذا ما انسحب اول من الناس انا افخ نفسي وذبح عليه.
While his point of view represents the extreme, almost everyone we spoke to in the Awakening movement wanted an end to the occupation and saw the alliance with the Americans as tactical and temporary. They say they need American help to confront a larger enemy, Shiite militias and the Shiite-led Iraqi government. It is an argument we heard repeatedly back in Baghdad, where sectarian fears run close to the surface. When civil war erupted in the capital, Shiite militias killed thousands of Sunnis and expelled close to half of the city's Sunni population.
في أول أيام أتصور يعني ما يقارب حوالي بال100 شيخ.
Abu Omar was an imam in Baghdad who fled his neighborhood after his mosque was taken over. He asked us not to use his real name, his face, or to mention which mosque he came from. He points out on the map hundreds of mosques that came under attack.
هي استطاعت الميليشيات أن مو بس تحتل المساجد بل أخذت البيوت اللي هي لأهل السنة وأخذت كذلك.
Abu Omar says that Shiite militias advanced across the city, neighborhood by neighborhood, seizing mosques and clearing out the Sunnis.
هي مناطق الرصافة هاي يعني منتهين من عتها، يعني ذيك الجهة منتهين من عتها. بنفس الوقت الميليشيات كان من هو يعمل في داخل الحكومة العراقية، يعني اللي هو في صفته مغاوير أو بصفته في الجيش العراقي أو في الحرس الوطني، عمل لصالح هذه الميليشيات تحت خيمة الحكومة. بالتالي الناس لم تستطع الثقة في لا بالحكومة ولا بالدولة ولا بالقانون، بدأوا يطلعون من المنطقة.
Baghdad Sunnis had much to fear from Shiite militias both inside and outside of the Iraqi government. That fear drove many former insurgents into an alliance with the Americans. Faras, a former member of Saddam's secret police, runs checkpoints in Baghdad's Adamiyah neighborhood for the Americans. His men were fighting against the Shiite-led Iraqi police when they joined the Sons of Iraq militia.
احنا قبل ما تتشكل ابناء العراق يعني اللي كانوا شباب صليف واهل المنطقه لمن كانوا يقامون الميليشيات المسلحه. الميليشيات المسلحه كانت اكثريتها متغلغله بمغاوير الداخليه والشرطه. كانوا يريدون يدخلون المناطق مالتنا، يلقون القبض على الشباب.
Farouk al-Obeidi, the former officer in Saddam's army who witnessed the president's last visit to Adamiyah, is a deputy commander of another Sunni militia in Adamiyah. He also joined with the Americans to fight Iraq's Shiite parties. Al-Obeidi sees them as nothing more than proxies for his national enemy, Iran.
يا أخي هي هاي الأحزابية تربت بإيران، يعني خلينا نكون واقعيين وصريحين. احنا أمام احتلالين بالعراق. احتلال الأمريكي واحتلال إيراني. نقدر نتعامل مع الأمريكان لطرد الإيرانيين والفرس من هذا البلد، وبعد ذلك نقدر نتحاور مع أمريكا بالخروج من بلدنا. نكون أمام خيار واحد، عدوي صديقي.
The Sunni militias outside of the city, in Anbar, also deeply distrust Iraq's ruling Shiite parties.
نرحب بالحضور جميعا، نرحب بالشيخ خميس حسناوي العيفان عضو مجلس محافظة الأنبار.
They are clamoring for a political role to match their new military and economic power.
احنا سواء استنفذنا كل الطرق ويا المقام حتى نفتح باب الترشيح.
Here in Fallujah, members of the Awakening have taken over seats on the city council and are pushing to remove the mayor to make way for their own candidate.
قلنا نستدعيه واذا ما اجى ناكد كتابنا مره ثانيه وراها شنو بصير عندنا حجه احنا نحاجج انه مقام طلع عن سيطرتنا واحنا بعد ما يفيدنا نهائيا.
ما بيقدر الترشيح ونقول له انت ما مسموح لك بالترشيح.
Members of the Awakening are using their patronage networks and their ties to the Americans to build local political power, and they are counting on the Americans to help them preserve that power when challenged by sectarian enemies in the Iraqi government and army.
You know, the truth is the Americans make many mistakes, but they didn't make mistakes because they hate the Sunnah. But the Iraqi army, they make mistakes because they have something in the heart against the Sunnah. So that the people, easy to us to forget everything bad happened from the American, but we can't forget what happened from the Iraqi army.
The Shiite government in Baghdad opposed the Awakening program from the beginning, but the Americans are betting that there can be a reconciliation between the two sides. On October 1st, the coalition forces, now led by U.S. General Raymond Odierno, began handing over control of the Awakening program to the Iraqi government.
The Baghdad government has agreed to pay the salaries of the Awakening forces. We're talking 100,000 people here. But there's no way, in my judgment, that you're going to see General Odierno, who really knows the score. There's no way he's just going to leave this to the tender mercies of the Baghdad government.
But the government of Nouri al-Maliki has only agreed to hire 20% of the Awakening militia's members and has put out arrest warrants for 650 of its leaders.
It's ties of patronage and reciprocity that have held it together. The fact that Iraq has had abundant oil resources has enabled the central state to dole out resources to people and buy loyalty. But without the patronage, I don't see this being held together very strongly for very long.
Bing West remains convinced that the U.S. military can force the Maliki government to put almost all the Awakening militia members on its payroll.
The Baghdad government is walking this fine bargaining line with us, but the Baghdad government understands that in the end, the Americans and General Odierno have the big hammer. So they'll fight against it, but they understand that there's a correct way of behaving. We just have to keep hammering at them, and hammering at them, and hammering at them.
But the situation in Iraq remains volatile. A week after our interview, Farouk al-Abaidi was killed in the street by a suicide bomber, along with 5 of his men and 9 civilians. We met al-Abaidi's commander, Abu Abid, in a small office in central Adamiyah. He blames the Shiite-led government for much of the continuing violence here and claims they are trying to hold on to their power before next year's elections.
هم أكيد هم علنوا برنامجهم الجديد لضرب قادة الصحوات. هنا بالأعظمية قاموا بعمليات عسكرية بسيارات مفخخة غيرها. أكيد هم بدأوا بهذا البرنامج لأنه يعرفون ما ظلت لهم قاعدة داخل البلد، قاعدة جماهيرية. فما ظلت لهم قاعدة، ما ظل لهم سبيل سوى أنه يضربون الرموز الموجودين اللي دا يحركون هاي القاعدتين.
Shortly after our interview, the Maliki government ordered the Iraqi army to arrest one of the Sons of Iraq militia leaders. He barricaded himself in his office with armed men until the Americans helped reach a deal with the Baghdad government.
The Sons of Iraq, there's a real unwillingness of the government at present to integrate them into the security forces. So there's a question of how you demobilize them at all.
أبناء العراق يعني أغلبيتهم أشخاص نظيفين وشجعان وأبطال لأن ضحوا بنفسهم لأجل أمن المنطقة. نتمنى من الحكومة العراقية، احنا كضباط أمن كنا سابقين، نتمنى من الحكومة العراقية أن تباوع علينا بالعين الصغيرة لو حتى مهمولين متروكين. أنا خدمتي
Sunni members of the awakening movement have a lot riding on the support of the Americans.
The Americans now are probably the only friend the Sunnis have.
But the Americans are also arming and training Iraq's ruling Shiite parties. The violence of the sectarian civil war has calmed, but calm does not mean reconciliation. The future of Iraq depends on a delicate balance between the central government, the Iraqi army, and America's tribal allies. A balance that will be difficult to maintain.
We may have adopted Saddam's tribal strategy, but we're just not at that level. We don't have his level of insight. We don't have quite the same combination of carrot and stick. We're clearly not there for the long haul. And even Saddam, let's be clear, by the late 1990s and early 2000s, even he was having a hard time managing the tribes. So if even Saddam was having trouble over the long run making this work, the United States is probably going to have an even harder time.